Raider volunteers came from every outfit in the regiment. About 400 in all. Colonel Sloan had not set a strength limit, but 400 we did not need. Our requirement was more like 40 other than the guys from G&E. The volunteers were a mixed bag, super gung-ho types who did not like trench warfare 8 balls. A cunning top kick was trying to unload bored troops just looking for adventure. We had little time to call through the herd of would-be warriors. We were on a short fuse to get ready with our first raid scheduled within a month. So I relied on a few of the former E and GNOs who knew what we were looking for to conduct the initial interviews. They quickly sent the jerks and thrill-seekers, marching the best and bravest they sent to me. Crispino, whom I'd made Raider platoon sergeant, sat in on my sessions with these first-cut candidates, and between the two of us it was usually easy to assess a man's mettle for the times when it wasn't. Chris had devised a brilliant screening technique that instantly separated the men from the boys he'd taken the powder out of a frag grenade and fired the primer cap separately. Then he'd reassembled the thing. And now, as I interviewed potential raiders, Chris would sit there playing with this dummy grenade near the end of the session. If I still wasn't sure about a man, I'd give Chris a wink, and he'd accidentally drop the grenade, the safety pin would fall out, and we'd jump back, horror and shock on our faces. Meanwhile, studying the guy's response to this live grenade spinning around on the floor. If the volunteer froze, we knew we didn't want him. If he threw himself on the grenade, we thought he was nuts, or at least suicidal, and we didn't want him either. But if he grabbed the thing and threw it out of the tent, or if he cut a trail out of the place himself, we knew he had good sense. He was a cool hombre and real raider material each fall. When every freshman expects to make the varsity squad, probably 300 volunteers were weeded out with our shotgun approach. A lot of good men too, some the persistent, kept coming back and finally made it, as we needed replacements. After Chris's and my cut, we still had far too many people, but at least it was a manageable number, and I knew that as with parachute or ranger training, more than half of these men would fall by the wayside over the next few weeks. Training started the minute an individual was accepted. The first week was all basic individual. Stuff how to scoot and shoot my foundation was solid Crispino Costello, and Wells from George and Emlan Smalling, Raleigh Lipka, Sovereign Bill Hearn and Jimmy Mamura from Easy were all seasoned combat warriors. The Raider NCOs taught most of the classes all hands-on, no classroom stuff, and every hour of every 20-hour training day became a test in which someone was eliminated, the weak fell out. The strong made it, and by the end of the week we were down to 60 guys. The second week was squad training your squad, I'd say, to an NCO train it. The men practiced ambush and counter-ambush techniques until they could do them in their sleep. The volunteers progressed from the basics to the more specific skills needed when operating behind enemy lines. How to cut throats, use a garrote and toss a razor-sharp hand axe with pinpoint accuracy attitude. Motivation, discipline, intelligence and common sense, physical fitness, and the ability to think under pressure were harshly measured. More men fell out, and we were down to 50. The final week we trained as a unit, repeating, until everything was second nature, well-planned raids on us, and South Korean installations served as the final exam. I figured if novices could infiltrate friendly positions protected by armed and shaky clerks who'd shoot to kill, then operating behind enemy lines would be a piece of cake when one raider patrol managed to uproot and abscond with a 30-feet flat flagpole from a South Korean Corps HQ, while guards Goose stepped all around the joint. I knew we were ready. We'd bottomed out at 47 lean, mean and damn proud raiders. The graduation exercise was a 10M run with full gear Colonel Sloan had given us. A blank check his word alone was the magic key to all the fat supply depots, and what could not be obtained legally, we bartered seed or stole. The training had already paid off stealth, and plenty of it made the Raiders the best band of thieves ever assembled in the U.S. Army. We knocked off tents, trucks, jeeps, beds, and even a complete operational field kitchen. We had enough rations and other goodies in our Elia to keep a regiment eating for a few days, including a bunch of Epicurean rations from the general's kitchen, which we sked while making off with 2 stoves. Nothing was safe and nothing was sacred. We sharpened our skills while improving our lifestyle. Life at our camp was good and promised to get even better. and our raid flag, a skull and crossed bones, flew high. The raiders' initial organisation was 4 11-man squads, all identical in organisation and equipment. Later, based on lessons learned in mission change, we would add a scout squad and beef up the assault force with a couple of LMGs. I decided that every guy could carry the weapon of his choice, as long as it was automatic. The M3 submachine grease gun was easy to get, and despite its weight, and the weight of its ammo was a favourite, but better still, if you could get one, was the snazzy, more reliable Thompson, which was in short supply. The Thompson had been phased out of the US Army after World War II. Chiang's nationalist Chinese army had had them for a while before the Red Chinese kicked Chiang's ass in 1949 and took them away. Now we were getting them back from dead Reds in Korea, musical Thompsons, and since both sides were dug in and the war was no longer one of movement, the game continued with combat soldiers swapping the weapons for firewater with non-combat types who wanted to play out the role of a Tommy gun-toing warrior MPS, confiscated the Thompsons from the rear echelon commandos as unauthorized weapons, and because automatic weapons could not be sent back to the States as war souvenirs, piles of them were ending up on the floors of ordnance depots. To the raider way of thinking, this was a real waste, and Chris took it upon himself to make a deal with an ordnance sergeant in Sol 1 Jeep for his Thompsons. The 25th Signal Company graciously provided the Jeep when the driver failed to chain lock the vehicle and pull the distributor, and the next morning 2 Raider Jeeps bumped down the main road to Seoul to make the swap. The ex-Signal Company Jeep's paint job wasn't totally dry, but with its new Raider markings it had no problem clearing the checkpoints where MPS were always on alert for hot vehicles. Our little convoy consisted of Chris and me and Bobby and Johnny, 2 Korean kids whose last names we never knew. Bobby was about 12, an orphan, his parents having been killed in the winter of 1950. He'd adopted me in the 3 of Easy when we were at Wujanggu. Now he was the Raider mascot and had come along today to find out what was left of his family. Outside chemo, Johnny was a 16-year-old Korean chogi bearer who'd been with us in George. He'd followed Chris to the Raiders and was, in his own words, Chris's #1 fix-it man. Chris was virtually the Buddha incarnate to young Johnny, and the boy tagged along everywhere, including raids, wearing a constant lopsided grin. The weapon swap went well, netting us 18 Thompsons and several hundred magazines. Bobby's family turned out to be 2 very lovely sisters, about 17 or 18 years old, who wanted to be Raiderettes. Chris and I figured they'd be great in the kitchen, and even better with other housekeeping functions, so we quickly said fatigues and headgear for our new recruits. I remembered the time in Trieste when the INR had relieved a unit on the Jug border. We'd gotten there before the guys in the outfit had awakened, and we'd been amazed because, zipped up in their fart sacks, all the men looked as big as Paul Boonen as the camp came to life, we discovered, and had been even more amazed the reason the soldiers appeared so gigantic, as each sack was unzipped out, crawled not just a trooper, but a Yugoslav girl who'd kept him warm all night. The platoon sergeant of the outfit explained that the girls were just part of the Hill group, and now they were here for the stay. Prena had said, "You can't break up a good thing, can you?" and let them stay for a few days at least. Like the girls, Bobby's sisters couldn't speak English, but they giggled and jabbered with their brother as they pushed long black hair inside helmet liners and slipped lovely bodies into baggy green fatigues, glancing at the girls hunched down in the back of our Jeep. They looked like 2 green Korean soldiers on the way to the front. I inwardly thanked Prena for setting such a considerate precedent on that hill in Italy in every way. Now the Raiders were ready to go, our first mission kind of a crawl. Before you walk thing was chosen by our immediate boss on Colonel Sloan's staff major, Willard Stow, the regimental intelligence officer. Chinese snipers were coming down from the hills before dawn and setting up in the flat ground facing B Company of the 27th. By first light they'd be in position and masterfully concealed. They used smokeless, flashless ammunition, making them impossible to spot. The men of B Company were afraid to stick their heads up, and rightfully so. Our job was to eliminate the snipers and try to snag a prisoner. The role we were about to perform was one previously fulfilled by ranger companies across the front, whose very raison d'etre was this sort of mission. But as of 1st August, all ranger outfits in Korea had been inactivated, One of the Pentagon's stated reasons for this move was that if there's only one guy in a regular unit squad who wants to fight, needed there to influence the other men. This same guy went. The logic was the one who would join a ranger unit, thus leaving the squad, be of inspiration. It sounded reasonable from Washington, but it seemed like a big mistake for the war, as it was. If nothing else, Colonel Sloan's urgency in getting his ad hoc raider unit up and running within a month of the Rangers' shutdown attested to that. Our shakedown cruise began at dusk on 28 of August. We assembled behind B Company, where I had a chance to talk to Lieutenant Jerome Jim Sudut, whose platoon we'd go through at Dark Goodman Sudut, World War II vet, 26 years old, a battlefield commission. Really a stud of a guy, Sudo's platoon was dug in along a raised railroad line that ran east-west along the Kuma Valley. Fortunately, the position's rear slopes provided good cover from the sniper fire and relative ease of movement, as long as you kept your tail down and moved fast. Unfortunately, there was no patrol path going out earlier. Another U.S. unit had seated the area knee in anti-personnel mines without keeping a record of where they were buried. Their short-term protection meant only long-term agony for subsequent units who had to find uncharted mines the hard way. It was a problem that had confronted infantry since the introduction of mines, and now it was ours. When it was dark, Sudut guided us to the edge of his wire and wished us good luck. "I'll have you know, Hackworth. I volunteered for your job." He said it had turned cold. I hadn't brought my field jacket, and Sudu took off his, insisting that I wear it. "There'll be coffee waiting for you in the morning," he added. I gratefully slipped on the jacket and eased out into the darkness. Crispino and I swapped turns at the lead. It was good to work with him again. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed him since I'd gone to Easy, 3 months before Chris had come to George in March, when the 8th Rangers, which is where I'd first met him, broke up. He was about 5 years older than I, but we had a great affinity, destined to win 2 DSCs, 2 Silver Stars, and 5 Purple Hearts over 2 tours of Korea. I don't mess around with the small change, he'd say years later, when asked why he'd never won a Bronze Star, too. Chris was a first-class fighter, and from our experience in the 3D of G, one of the finest point men I'd ever seen. He was also the unit's lead singer around those inspiring closer walk with the campfires. He was a really talented musician who could play anything beer. Bare winter's ground, after a few days we'd let them go. The ones the Chinese had managed to hold on to or had infiltrated throughout the year were for the sole purpose of resupply, so the horse trap on the trail was a good sign. Most likely we were going to have visitors. We waited 47 men, including rear and flank security, lying prone in a killing zone about 100 yards long. Our weapons were set on full automatic, with safeties off grenade pins were straightened too. All the raiders were connected to one another by way of a thin wire running from hand to hand. 3 quick pulls on the wire meant enemy, then 1 pull for each joker entering the gauntlet. I was in the center of the ambush. I'd trigger it with a blast from my submachine gun, only when the fish were well into the net with Don Neri, my RTO, simultaneously firing a hand flare our SOP, then called for each raider to fire 1 mag toss, 2 grenades, and pour in another mag. After 3 hours of waiting, the only blood drawn was our own. The ambush site was in mosquito country, big mosquito country. None of us used repellent. Chinese could smell it as easily as aftershave soap tobacco and toothpaste. We couldn't slap at them. Noises travelled loud and far at night, so we waited and reluctantly contributed our blood. I was well protected. Jim Sudut was a giant of a man, and his jacket was like a tent. I could almost crawl up into it. A lot of the guys who, like me, hadn't thought they'd need their field jackets were not so lucky, but just as they'd set up the ambush now they were maintaining it like pros, despite the thousands of little stinging bites on hands, faces, and necks. We made no contact. The mosquitoes finally won by a TKO. We had to get home by daybreak. We saddled up and took a different route back to avoid the possibility of a Chinese ambush along the path we had taken out. We had about 400 yards to go when the sun started to peek its nose out of the eastern sky Chris was leading, and I told him to pick up the pace suddenly. He stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned and whispered in my ear, "I smell the enemy." I took a long sniff. "Chris, you're hallucinating. There are no enemies here," he insisted. No, I smell them. They're around here somewhere. The sun was really starting to make its move. Now I had the monkey on my back. We had to return to our lines in a hurry, or we'd get the crap chopped out of us in the middle of no man's land. No one had told me the raider's maiden voyage was codenamed Titanic. Let's get the hell out of here, I whispered. Good soldier Crispino started off again with me breathing fire down his neck. He took one more step. Look. Hack, they're here. I smell them. Chris, get behind me. I'll take the point. I had taken no more than 5 steps when I heard a metallic click. I knew the sound. A bolt going back on a weapon a fraction of a second later. Little red flames licked out of the darkness from a distance of 5 feet slugs, leaving a Chinese burp gun. I felt the slug smashing into my stomach even before I heard the report. I hosed down the flames. With a long burst of .45 caliber slugs simultaneously jumping to the right and hitting the deck, the raiders took up their anti-ambush positions automatically. As I tossed 2 grenades while spraying another mag after one more grenade, I charged the ambush, blasting away. Steve Prenner, look out, you taught me. Well, moments later, 6 dead Chinamen were stretched out in the tall grass, but Chris was also down and very still, about 5 feet away. It was light enough now that I could see his head was covered with blood. I felt sick as I slowly turned him over. Chris looked up at me with vacant eyes, then slowly a sly, mischievous grin crossed his face. See, Hack, I told you I smelled them, he said, and the enemy did smell. Having a nose for trouble on the battlefield for contact was not just an instinctive thing, particularly at night. Smells seemed to carry as far as sound in the darkness. Curiously, the intelligence value of the enemy smell seemed to apparent only to the troops on the ground. The rear echelon commandos took little stock in it, as evidenced by a story Phil Gilchrist told me sometime. Later, after Phil won his DSC, he'd been moved to division. As the assistant operations officer, he was in the Division Tactical Operations Center TIOC, when I once reported through regiment that my raider patrol was close to the enemy, because we could smell them, according to Gilchrist. The boys at division thought this was funny, and asked one another just how many can he smell. Phil, who was the only one there who had smelled the enemy on a night patrol, kept his mouth shut. Having learned long before, in his own words, that the last thing a combat officer can do is intrude upon the ruminations of the non-fighting elite of the army, was it any wonder, then, that the average U.S. fighting man in Korea was sent into the field smelling like the corner drugstore? Of course, I wouldn't let the raiders go that way. We went as natural as tars, and in the jungle it didn't bother me if our aroma wouldn't have set well with the folks back home. I was concerned about the Chinese. After all, their enemy smelled too, when aged Chris wasn't dead, and there was no chance of him dying. I had another look at the dead Chinese. They looked like an FO team, but a number of them were armed with SKSs. They had not set up yet, but it looked as though they were just going into position when we surprised them by coming up from behind. Their mission had probably been to puto a little heat on the main line, with some well-directed HNI fire and selective sniping. Well, not this time. I thought it was broad daylight by the time we scooped up their radio weapons and papers and made tracks to the Cut & B Company's wire. When we arrived, Sergeant Costello, another G Company stud who'd also served in the 8th Rangers, loaded the raiders on our waiting trucks and took them home. Sudat took Chris and me to his CP so the doc could go to work. I felt no pain. Hell, I should be dying with multiple slugs in the gut, I thought. But except for my hands, which were covered with small wounds and swelling to the size of mini baseball gloves, there was no blood gushing from anywhere. Doc Brakeman said, "Lie down here, Lieutenant, and let me have a look." I glanced over at Chris. He was kneeling a few feet away, drinking the steaming hot coffee Jim had promised, and which I wasn't allowed to have with my gut wound. He was a casting director's dream. Old Crispino, the wounded warrior, blood still dripping down the side of his face. No, Doc, don't worry about me. Take care of Crispino. Take care of the enlisted swine." The doc went over to Crispino. Chris said, "Oh no, Doc, I'm just a lowly enlisted man. Take care of the officer. The officer is far more important. WM can always be replaced." We continued playing the game, ricocheting poor, confused Doc Brakeman back and forth. The doc didn't really know us yet and couldn't understand our warped sense of humour. Finally, he gave up trying and took care of Chris. It turned out his wounds were not serious. They just bled like hell. One slug had clipped his earlobe and the other had grazed his skull like a razor slash. By the looks of things, the Chinese gunner must have panicked he hadn't held his weapon down, and the recoil had lifted the fire from my gut to Chris's head to the stars. But we were just damn lucky there wasn't a pro. He could have cut both of us in half and done some serious damage to the utter column too. Then it was my turn, but when the doc laid me down and cut open the side of my jacket. He found no wound. He unbuttoned the jacket and pulled back the other clothes. There was no blood, no nothing. I had small cuts and lots of steel splinters all over my face, neck, chest, and the backs of my hands, but no bullet holes. But I'd been hit in the gut. I knew it unless I was the one who'd been hallucinating. It was time to call it a night. We said goodbye to Sudut and his gang and gave them a couple of SKS rifles for their hospitality. Between my blood and Doc Brakeman knife the jacket Pseudo had loaned me was pretty well done for. I promised to send him a new one with something fluid in the pocket, but I never saw him again. He was killed 2 weeks later, leading a platoon attack against a firmly entrenched enemy position. When his body was found, there were half a dozen or so enemy dead scattered all around him in the trench. The lieutenant had run out of ammo but not out of fight. The last of the enemy defenders had been got with Pseudo's trench knife. The doc at the regimental aid station patched us up properly. Chris would be down for a few weeks, but my wounds were superficial. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with a few shots of penicillin Tennessee whiskey and some deft strokes with a scalpel to get the steel out an easy Purple Heart. But I still couldn't understand it. My next stop was Regimental S2. Major Stow had set up his intelligence shop in a large LGE sandbag general-purpose GP tent surrounded by concertina wire in the regimental headquarters complex. I placed my weapon on the table out front, following SOP magazine out bolt-back weapon on safety. Too many well-armed clerks had blasted each other with unloaded firearms inside tents, and went inside with stall. I covered everything that happened after we crossed the LD, the minefield, the terrain, the vegetation, the horse crap, the smells, the noises, the contact at the end, in passing. I told the Major how certain I was about getting hit in the gut. He jokingly suggested that I'd gone Asiatic, whatever that meant, and I left picking up my weapon on the way out. But when I flipped the grease gun over to close the bolt and insert the magazine, there, staring up at me, was a jagged hole the size of a 50-cent piece. So I wasn't crazy. I had been hit, and the steel splinters were bits and pieces from my all-metal M3. I couldn't resist running back into Major Stambour's tent so he could have a look at it. He told me to go home and get some sleep. Del Evans heard I'd been hit, and he came to visit the raider camp later that morning to check on friends and get the full scoop. He disassembled my damaged weapon, and upon examination we saw that 3 slugs had ripped through the trigger housing assembly. The slugs had gone through the oil thong case, then through the bolt retracting mechanism and smashed into but not penetrated the other wall. The wall that was up against my gut, my weapon was an M3L modified with a recess in the bolt to draw it back. The retracting mechanism had been made redundant by this modification, and shouldn't even have been there, so it was almost as though some thoughtful ordnance man had left it in somehow knowing that it would be perfect to slow down 39 Men-M communist slugs and thus save my life. Chris managed to get out of the hospital early. I think he was worried that I, of all people, would take advantage of living alone in our tent with the 2 lovely raiderettes who'd gotten tired of the full-time army life, but who still visited on occasion. The thought had not crossed my mind, because Costello had moved in with me as acting platoon sergeant while Chris was away. Castell was actually on his way home through normal rotation, because his days were numbered. I wanted to be sure he experienced the best of the raider life, and on one particularly hot day between the early raids, I was dismayed to find him stretched out on his rack sleeping. I woke him up Costello Latun go for a swim screw. That he mumbled, "I want to sleep, Costello. I'll blow your head off if you don't get out of that sack and come with me." Costello knew I'd pulled the clip and emptied the thing, upon returning from the previous raid, so he told me to get screwed. I took careful aim and squeezed bang. The son of a gun was loaded. The slug missed Costello's head by an inch and blew a hole in his air mattress. I don't know who was more shocked as we both watched his bed slowly deflate, but he did go swimming. I doubt I've ever seen anyone happier to rotate home. Jack Speed, my favourite Tennessee wheeler-dealer, and at 23, the oldest raider, besides Chris, took Costello's place and watched me like a hawk. By the time Chris got back, the raiders had completed 6 successful missions with no casualties. Save on the first one, the tasks had been varied and chosen by Major Stow, according to intelligence needs all required. Stealth and skill, but not everyone required the full raider force. We only took as many men as needed to do the job, be it taking a prisoner for interrogation, getting enemy uniforms for line crossers, raiding an outpost, whatever the S2 assigned to us. And from each raid we learned more and got better. The missions gradually became more difficult, taking us farther and farther behind enemy lines, or into territory so hot it might take 5 hours to crawl 100 yards. Advanced training was dictated by mission requirements, and anyone with experience shared in the teaching, like Costello and Crispino, who'd both been ranger trained at Benning and Emlan, who in some hard Pacific fighting had taken shrapnel from a Japanese round right in the face, and his fellow Texan Tex Garvin, who were both World War II ex-Marines. My own snooping and pooping INR experience was invaluable too, and we'd all sit around and discuss techniques, the old pros. Adding much to the ever-growing repertoire of our tricks with Chris's return came a mission to destroy 4 caves burrowed into the side of a hill deep behind enemy lines. What aerial photos and the intelligence experts suspected to be a supply depot artillery had already tried to close the place down with zero effect. TAC Air couldn't get in there at all, because the Chinese had too many automatic weapons on Hill 1062, which fired on the aircraft. Our mission was simply to blow the caves and return. It sounded easy, but it wasn't few of them, where we had to slip through the main Chinese defensive line, make it through real bandit country before we even got to the caves, then blow them up and get out, as if nothing had happened, all in exactly 10 hours. It was not much time during an aerial recon. The uneasiness I'd felt during the first one had passed, and now I requested them whenever possible. I found the simplest way to make the raid. Many trails and secondary roads crisscrossed the area around the objective, and a large creek ran almost to the caves. We'd way up the centre of that creek. It would cover any noise and simplify navigation. I would take only 2 squads into the objective area, Mamura scouts, to get us there, and David Fort's demolition people. We took lethal packages of plastic explosives, C4, and in addition each raider carried 2 thermite grenades. I figured if we didn't blow them up, we'd burn them out. We registered artillery concentrations along our route, and for 2 nights before the raid the gunners hammered away. We'd use them during the raid too. The noise would help cover our movement, and the flying steel might encourage the enemy to stay in their holes. Another benefit was that the guns would be warm and gunners ready in case we needed their magic punch to get our asses out of a crack. At 1600 hours raid day, everyone was standing tall. The raider standard uniform was fatigues or coveralls, and black knit caps and sneakers. Black was the order of the day as much as possible. Our faces and hands, too, smeared liberally with the end of a burned cork loose-clothes dog tags, and anything that made noise were tied down with OD tape or held tight with rubber strips cut from inner tubes. Chris conducted the inspection, which by now was SOP. Each raider had to run in place, hit the ground and roll without making one sound before he could board the truck. We slipped through friendly lines at dark, and by 20 Earth hours we were behind the main enemy line. We moved fast with Miyamura and 2 of his scouts far to our front. About 100 yards from our objective, we halted and formed a tight defensive perimeter. Jimmy insisted that he go alone for a look at the caves. There was no point in debating the issue. Jimmy Mamura was like a cat at night, totally unafraid. We'd been together for 4 months in easy, and by now I was well used to his little midnight walks through enemy lines. I loved Jimmy, we all did. He was a no-nonsense gunfighter, a samurai warrior who preferred operating by himself, but he was also a quiet, unassuming, first-generation Japanese-American, and he had this strange thing about rank. Jimmy was a PFC when he joined the Raiders, and every time I tried to promote him, He wouldn't accept it. He was ready and willing to do any job, as it was his role as squad leader called for the rank of E6, but he just didn't want to be an NCO. It didn't matter to me. But somehow I really felt that after he went home, which was in only a couple of months, and got out of the army, the time would come when he'd regret his attitude about not wanting rank. So without telling him, I decided to promote him anyway, one stripe at a time, and little did he know. But PFC Jimmy Mamura was already a staff sergeant. An hour after he had gone, Jimmy returned with the word that there was nothing in the caves, that they hadn't been used in a long time. There was also no sign of Chinese, but the main track was well used with horse crap all over it, and north of the caves there was a rough wooden bridge that spanned the creek we had come up. Jimmy suggested we blow the bridge. It seemed like a good idea. We had enough demo to blow up the Golden Gate anyway, and it was crazy taking the stuff back, and besides, it was good training. Jimmy provided security, while Fort wired the bridge to explode. When we were 60 minutes down the track, we hustled out of there, and an hour later the bridge blew with a thundering roar whether or not we made contact with the enemy. It was near impossible to relax, much less sleep, after a raid. It took a long time for the adrenaline to stop pumping. You couldn't just flop down and switch off. Most of us would go for a good swim in the river that flowed right by our little camp. We'd play on the beach and in the water, just to let off some steam, and slowly unwind afterwards. We'd pick the raid apart. Lessons learned screw-ups, and who should get his walking papers over a mighty breakfast of steak and eggs washed down with beer. Then we might play some softball, and only around noon would we crap out and sleep for 10 or 12 hours by midnight. Most guys were up again, and a party would be rocking the raider camp, complete with open kitchen, 190 proof on the rocks, and weather permitting midnight swims. It wasn't bad duty. We raided one night and had the next 3 off. It sure beat the hell out of hiding in the bottom of a hole on the front, and having heat dumped on you 24 hours a day. One evening, for some reason I wasn't in the mood for the usual first night after the raid roaring party, and hit the sack early. The rest of the guys got drunker and drunker, and deciding I was a party pooper, marched into my tent to tell me so I was asleep. I woke up to find myself weaving in mid-air in the pitch-black night, as 6 raiders held my cot over their heads, and Congo lined through the darkness. I told them to leave me alone, but the more protested, the more convinced the troops were that I had to come to the party. Then one guy got the idea to toss me cotton all into the river. This course of action was hotly disputed. There seemed to be 2 knee-knocking drunk schools of thought on the issue: leave the old man alone versus drown the bastard. Meanwhile, I just swayed in the air, listening to all this and contemplating my fate. I was about to do a parachute landing fall PLF off the thing when the conflict accelerated with the introduction of firepower. One of the troopers pulled out a pistol and started shooting into the sky. Scratch the PLF, I thought, lying as flat and thin as I could in my little cut, looking at the stars, and wondering if I would soon be among them. The water was cold, but everyone jumped in to salvage my bed. My blankets and me and the boys had their wish. I warmed up by the fire and joined in the fun as the raiders continued to party, on through the night. War stories flew, and we were just a bunch of kids having a big old time. Colonel Sloan had promised us a unit RNR. After the 10th raid, morale was high as we returned from yet another night assault on yet another small hill in front of the 3rd Bat. We'd had no friendly casualties for the dozen or so Chinese we'd killed, and in a few days we'd be in Japan. We carefully woe our way along King Company's patrol path, which cut through a triple strand of barbed wire and mines no more than 30 yards from the fighting positions. An LMG let go, a long burst. It must have been 30 rounds. I could see the tracers coming in one long fiery flood. They skipped over my head by what seemed to be inches. I screamed, "Raiders, raiders, shut off that fire." No one was hurt except the gunner. Chris jumped into his bunker and stomped him to a pulp. The gunner's platoon leader, NCOs, and fellow soldiers watched silently, condoning our on-the-spot. Raider punishment. The guy had been asleep at his post. He must have awakened and panicked when he saw our dark figures coming at him. Fortunately, his firing was as accurate and reliable as his vigilance. The bastard could have killed a dozen good men. Getting ready for RNR was almost as complex in operation as any raid. All we could leave in the camp was authorized stuff, which meant packing, storing, and hiding just about everything we had. The last thing we needed was some inspector to find anything irregular about our special unit. We'd grown accustomed to the luxuries of life, and the stakes were too high to leave the place anything but perfect. The biggest problem was our vehicles, most of which we ended up hiding in a deep drawer behind the camp. My new Jeep went off to Ordnance for engine repair, and when everything was squared away, Barney K. Neal organised a few of his bakers to stay at the raider camp for security. Barney K. himself came with us what manual you wanted to believe, but the rest was non-existent and the rag was paid for in advance. So to a guy fresh from the front, R&R was simply 120 precious hours, all of which would be accounted for and none of which would be wasted. Lovely little girl Sands floated between guys every 5 days they honeymooned with a new husband. The stars of the group were passed through units like a good weapon, many of them as proud of their outfit as regulars me. Wolfhound girl San never happened. Me stay with cacti, you want cacti girlan, go see Rosie, if we could have just frozen time countdown. Korea began the minute you touched down in Japan, even before the first sweet cold sip of fresh milk you'd had for a year passed your lips in the R&R Center in Osaka or Tokyo. The hardest thing during those wonderful 5 days was to stop the clock running in your head deep 6, the clock you'd tell yourself in a sea of booze and drink some more to drown each tick, which brought you that much closer to the front. Eat, drink, and be merry. Finally, the world of death and horror is far away. Danger, that constant cruel companion who haunts you every day, is suddenly cut loose and left behind the best clubs, the best steaks, the best girls are yours forever, until a car backfires and you're hurtled back to the whole mad thing while frantically searching for cover in the middle of the Ginza Strip. I steered clear of the other raiders in Tokyo. Basically, I didn't want to cramp their style like a chaperone at a high school dance whose mission in life is to take names and kick half-bared asses out of darkened hallways and janitors' closets. I joined forces instead with Barney K. I didn't want the raiders to cramp my style either, and though Barney stayed true to his stateside bride Belle, the two of us still managed to take the city by storm. 5 days and a 3-hour plane ride later, it was back to the front for most of us. And one mean shock, there were no smiling faces. No eagerness to pick up those Thompsons and go on a raid. Of course, this was probably for the best, given that it took almost a week before all the guys got back. About half of the raiders who'd gone to Tokyo had ended up in jail. One group had smuggled in a Chinese submachine gun on a drunken spree. They'd shot out neon lights all over the Tokyo nightclub district. Another squad had infiltrated a nearby US Navy club. They tried to drink all the rum torpedo the ladies and sink all the swabbies. All in all, the raiders hitting Japan as a unit had led to a pretty rough 5 days for the old land of the rising sun, leaving the natives only to shake their heads and rue the day they decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. Colonel Sloan was not amused by the conduct of his elite creation. The raiders had gotten into more trouble in 5 days than the whole regiment had in 6 months of R&R. We had sinned, but sinned good. No one suggested deactivating the force. In fact, Sloan's XO Lieutenant Colonel Smith, a man so caring we called him Mother, did wonders to prevent Sloan getting the full skinny on the raiders' R&R escapades. But the good colonel did lock my heels together. He told me there would be no more unit R&Rs, and it was highly doubtful there would even be individual raider and hours for some time down the track. Your boys are all volunteers and they're taking on extremely dangerous assignments. I don't expect them to be Boy Scouts, on the other hand. I cannot overlook gross violations of discipline, he said, suggesting. I return order to the ranks, muy pronto. Jack Speed, spokesman for the transgressors, explained their behaviour, the best you know. Hack you get over there, and they give you a goddamn steak and a glass of milk and all that, and you finally realise what life is all about. I don't know, we just went goofy, I understood, but it wasn't going to wash with Sloan. So I took the boys on long runs, especially close to the Wolfhound CP, all the while barking, "All right, you bastards, you think you're so bad." And the colonel and staff could hear the raiders chant their mournful repentance. It took a different kind of leader to understand and handle the sort of animals I had on my hands. I was well suited for the job. Mostly because I helped make them animals, and probably because I was one of the biggest animals of them all. So for me, as their leader, the worst part of the R&R business was not the embarrassment with Sloan, but the fact that the only difference between my boys and me was that I didn't get caught. It was just a case of a unit with spirit uncontrolled, maybe. But still, spirit, which is the essence of success in battle. Spirit makes all things possible. Spirit is what made the raiders. And if from the outside it looked as if we had too much, that was something only I had to deal with. My boys didn't give a damn about rules and regulations. But neither did I. What was the point? Every day we lived with such danger, we kind of figured the next would be our last anyway. And if it wasn't, and we had to pay the price with higher command, what could they do, put us back in the raiders and send us behind enemy lines? The Japan raid might well have been forgotten, but for two incidents. First, 2 weeks after our return, a couple dozen cases of clap appeared among the raider ranks. The regimental surgeon congratulated me for having my unit equal the regimental VD record for the past month. Second, the jeep we hid an ordnance was found by its owner. It seemed that a wise old motor sergeant from the E. Cacti Medical Company had recognized his missing chariot in my Raiders 1. He must have remembered some little dent or other odd scars or modifications. He'd pulled out his jackknife, and a few careful scrapes across 2 coats of paint revealed the cacti insignia, sir. That jeep is not a wolfhound jeep. I explained to Regimental XO Mother Smith, unsmiling but sympathetic. Smith assured me he was well aware of this, but how he wondered did it come to have 27th Raider insignias I couldn't exactly say. Well, sir, the jeep was found on post, and some gumshoe artist was fiddling around, and suddenly our numbers were on the vehicle, and what the hell it belonged to that rotten 35th Regiment. But I did. Colonel Smith was not amused. The 35th wanted AEAD, someone had to be court-martialed, but he said we could probably do a deal, hold the court-martial, satisfy the 35th Co., lose the paperwork, and the matter would be forgotten. The Raider Mafia met before the Soonette. Why don't we tell the truth? Suggested Chris Scoschi got the jeep. What? What do you mean? I got the jeep, Crispino. You're a lying son of a gun. Little Johnny Watkins cried as he grabbed his weapon and slammed a magazine into it. Chris belted him in the mouth. The blow sent Soshi flying, but no one intervened after all. Watkins had been about to blow Chris away. Damn Scoschi, I'm just pulling your leg, Chris told him as he helped the boy to his feet. We wouldn't make you take the rap. Okay, look, he said, turning to the rest of us. All business, we'll tell the truth. I got the jeep. I found it. Another voice chimed in, yeah, it was abandoned over near the shower unit. It wasn't locked or anything. And it was getting dark. Thought a Korean would steal it. Yeah, so we brought it home for the night next morning. One of the guys was just screwing around and painted on our markings. Right, said Chris. And by the time I woke up, the new Raider Jeep was on its way to Seo for a scamming trip. And when it came back, well, it was 3 days later, and nobody had been asking about no Jeep. And then we'll tell him it belonged to the 35th anyway, and they're just a bunch of no-good. Sons of guns, so we kept it. I'll take the blame. Chris was court-martialed by one of the regimental staff officers the next afternoon. He was found guilty, admonished and fined part of a month's pay. The two of us drove back from regiment pleased that the heat was off and justice had been done. We knew the guys had been worried we hadn't told them about our backroom talks and that the court was fixed. Some things had to remain sacred, but as long as they were still in the dark, we decided to play out just one more scene in the drama. We arrived back at camp, our faces. Grim, Chris went into our tent and began to pack his gear. How did it go? The guys yelled in unison, "What's he doing?" Asked Johnny Watkins. I told them that Chris was getting his no-good ass right out of the outfit, that in order to save himself from jail, he had squealed on us and all of our unauthorized activities. The radar, Retters, the other stolen vehicles, the rations, everything. A couple of the guys got so pissed off they grabbed their Thompson submachine guns and started for our tent, as if to finish off the job Soshi had tried to start the night before. I hadn't expected that our script called for a happy ending. Not Chris's brains splattered all over the camp. I took the weapons away. Look, let me handle this, mercifully, on cue. Chris came out of the tent as per script. We went to an open field about 300 yards from where the raiders were sitting there. I proceeded to stomp the hell out of my friend. Then Chris started to stomp the hell out of me a kick in. The face a fierce blow to the head, a thundering flip on the back, but it was all stuntman stuff like buddies faking it on the back lot. Every boot and every blow was stopped before it sank home. Finally, we both got bored. It was time to wind the thing up. The finale came when Chris the villain kneed me. I rolled into a ball, and he started to finish me off with vicious kicks to the face, but like the true clean-cut all-American boy was, I pulled myself up on his tattered uniform, cold, cocked him and walked away. Victorious, that'll take care of that squealing son of a gun, I said, slapping my hands together as the rest of the raiders looked on in horror. Let's have a beer when Chris got up, dusted himself off and joined the party. Everyone had a good laugh, but it'd be fair to say the two of us had a hard time making the raiders believe much of anything. After that, a few more good raids made regiment forget all our transgressions, and by late October there was not one hill or valley throughout the regimental sector that the raiders had not ventured across. It was indeed difficult to find an objective where we had not been before battlefield circumstances and in depth had phased out our original raider role. Our mission assignments now came from operations. We had become the Diao Regimental Assault Force. I was always on guard against higher headquarters playing games with my unit. I well remembered how the 8th Rangers had been misused and virtually destroyed in November, and most of the other specially trained airborne ranger companies in Korea met the same fate. Historically, special units have always been thrown into the breach to stem the tide. Everyone knows that 10 spirited fighters are far better than a herd of 1,000 listless dragasses, but many commanders on the Korean battlefield were beginning to behave like desperate gamblers, ignoring the reality that it was far easier for the planners to draw a circle on a map and claim it as a critical objective than it was for mortal men to seize it. So with morale in the trench is already lower than whale crap. Kosos across the front were calling for well-trained, well-motivated cannon fodder ranger-raider specialists to do the jobs their own do-foots would or could not do themselves. It took great command wisdom not to ruin a fine thoroughbred by having it pull the plough when the mule was down. Colonel Sloan exercised this wisdom, and the regimental S3 Major Robert Glazer backed him up to the best of his ability. Glazer was a seasoned combat man with 2 wars under his belt. Until his recent promotion, he'd commanded a 3D Bat rifle company, so he knew well how to keep his planners in tight rein and make certain the Gree Pencil warriors did not promote schemes that would put the raiders in serious jeopardy. Still, our missions were no longer based on stealth and skill, but rather on shock and firepower. It didn't help that little by little, through battle casualties and normal rotation, we were losing some of the original raiders. Fortunately, the replacements adopted our what-the-hell attitude, and we accepted each mission as we had all to date fatalistically, even when it meant retaking a position in broad daylight for 3 days. We'd sat in foxholes behind the first bat to whom we were temporarily attached. Indications had been that the Chinese would attack in force right down the center of the regiment. The raider role was to block an enemy penetration, if the guys ever thought they were pardas. This duty quickly dispelled the idea our position should have been held by a 200-man rifle company. We had less than a fourth of that number and were armed. With only assault weapons great for close-in stuff, but not red-hot in the defence, we did not have mortars, entrenching gear, or even steel pots. We were David waiting for Goliath minus the slingshot. The Chinese threw a fair amount of artillery and mortar fire around, but did not launch the expected attack it was when they overran an outpost in front of a company that IST Bat decided to send their raiders to get it back in daylight. Why not? I guess the rationale was that we were attached to them for the moment, so why get any of their own killed when someone else will go for free? The op was located on a little knob about 600 yards from the main line. We moved up before dawn. I would have preferred making night attack, but Lieutenant George Creamer of a company had said that at night there was no way to crawl through the barbed wire and mines that previous US defenders had laid on the slopes. We clobbered the hill with artillery and kept it pouring while we worked our way to the top in single file, disarming mines along the op patrol path. The position did not have any tactical value to the enemy. The attack had either been a feint or a psychological exercise, a demonstration by kamikaze troops that the Chinese were the bad guys in the valley. In any event, the Chinese raiders had flown the coop by the time we reached the top. I called the main line to tell them the goddamn position had been retaken, courtesy of the raiders, and they could come out and relieve us any time they wanted. Now it was just a case of tidying up before they arrived. We stacked up the US dead. It looked as if they'd been asleep at the switch. The Chinese must have slipped through their defences and knocked them off all at once, and started cleaning up the position down below. A few of my guys began opening a wider path through the minefield for the relieving force. I went down to have a look. I moseyed around the position a bit, and when the boys yelled all clear, I started back to the top, only then noticing that one of my boots had tripwire wrapped all around it. Normal debris from diffused mines. I gave my leg a mighty kick to get rid of the stuff. My troops hit the ground instantly before I could figure out why a bouncing Betty exploded about 4 feet away from me, sending scores of ball bearings into the air. When the dust settled, I was still standing up untouched. "What the hell are you guys doing down there?" I asked as the boys slowly got up and looked at me in amazement. The fact was, my hearing had deteriorated a lot after I got hit in the head on 6th February. The only difference between the mine clearers and me was that I hadn't heard the click when the firing mechanism went. "Thought you idiots had cleared this area." I barked and hot-footed it back to the top of the knob so I could go into shut-in private. It would just become part of the legend. "Let me tell you about our old man. Our co doesn't give a damn about anything. You know how he clears a path through minefields? He just walks out and stomps and kicks. He blows the crap out of mines and isn't even touched. Or the time when Chris was chopping wood in front of our tent, standing there in his shorts legs. Apart, his pistol lay on top of his rack. I picked up the weapon and squinted through the sights right between Chris's legs. What a tempting shot. I took careful aim at the log he was splitting no more than 6 feet away and squeezed the trigger, figuring the pistol wasn't loaded. Bang! The slug went between Crispino's legs, missed the log, and cut the axe handle in two as Chris followed through on a downward chop. It scared the crap out of both of us, but I pretended I'd hit. My target bullseye. I never squeezed rounds off an unloaded weapon again. It was a lesson I should have learned years before when I overheard old Sergeant Walker in Italy counselling a young kid who'd playfully pointed his weapon at him. "Don't ever point a weapon at someone unless you intend to kill him," said Walker, who'd seen combat in Africa, Sicily and Italy. I know, because some damned fool killed me that way, but when I got up to the pearly gates, St. Peter said, "You're too young and too handsome to be here now. I want you to go back and teach all those careless young fools who point their weapons at their friends." Even so, the legend only grew with stories like that, and yes, has another one of my guys in the rear. Not only is the son of a gun scared of nothing, but he can shoot an axe handle off an axe between a guy's legs. I knew the minefield incident was built on bad hearing, and the axe handle shot was just sheer stupidity cancelled out by good luck. But that's the stuff a legend has to keep to himself. Soldiers need legends. It's a way to deal with the madness of war, like the legend of Roger Young, a quiet, shy man who won the Medal of Honor in the Saul Islands in World War III for leading a daring attack against strongly defended Japanese positions. He died in the attempt, courageously ignoring his buddies' calls to stay down, and was immortalized in a #1 hit song among the boys in Olive Drub, "For the everlasting glory of the infantry shines." The name shines the name of Roger Young only after the war. Was it revealed that Roger Young was almost totally deaf? He'd faked his hearing to get into the fighting, and his bravery on the day he died was most likely a result of not hearing the warning shouts of his friends. But it didn't matter. By then Roger Young was a legend, and his very name got many soldiers through the night living. Legends serve a similar purpose if the troops can go into battle, secretly knowing that among them lurks a Scooter, Burke, a Superman, and Clark Kent's ODS. They'll fight better, they'll fight harder, and they'll somehow believe that immortality is theirs too. But this presents a problem for a leader legend because you reach a point where you can't let your men know you make mistakes. You just can't, even when it means you become trapped somewhere between who you really are and what they want you to be. All I ever wanted was to be a good soldier. And I was, but to myself I was certainly not a hero inside. I was an embarrassingly uneducated, insecure kid of 20 with a terrible temper and lots of luck. Both traits more than likely inherited from my Irish mother. Fury accounted for most of the heroic acts chalked up to my name. Going after that sniper on 6th of February, where the whole legend began, was more than anything the work of a hungry Irishman temporarily off his nut, still on the outside. I played the role, and even encouraged the hero business. After all, showmanship is vital to being a good troop commander. The only problem was that my audience kept demanding encore after encore many times in a firefight. When the slugs were really snapping, I'd find myself snugged up close to a solid dirt wall or behind a tree enjoying perfect cover. And just as I'd begin thinking how comfortable I was, I'd start feeling the eyes of my command boring in saying, "We're in a real tough spot here, baby. Just what trick are you going to pull out of the old hat to save our sweet asses?" And always pulled out something with one more wild or brazen stunt, confirming to my troops, and maybe to myself too, that I was the bravest dude on the before Napoleon promoted a general to field marshal. He would ask one question: "Are you lucky?" And only if the answer was yes would Napoleon pass on the baton. I was lucky. That little bit of magic followed me as closely throughout my career as the smell of battle, and it followed the raiders too in the fall of 1951, through dozens of raids behind enemy lines, and within our own irrefutable cases of insubordinate and wild behaviour, and enough 190 proof to keep a hospital going for a year. Yes, the raiders, my own little army composed solely of field marshals, were lucky, and we were going to live forever. I never wanted to die, but I never feared death either. I guess I always knew that the price of admission to life was one, death. My father and mother both paid it before I was a year old, and Uncle Roy just 8 years later, his a lingering death from the mustard gas and other wounds he sustained in World War I with me. I figured when it came it would be with the roll of the dice. It was really a matter of luck and probability. The more missions, the more point duty, the more hot engagements, the higher the probability of getting zeroed out, and if you had to go sure, you wanted to do it heroically. But real heroism, I believed, was just returning to the front when you knew the score and how the game was played, and when you knew what it was like to have hot steel ripping through your body, and your wounds healed in a ward full of kids your age who might never walk, see and think the same again on the occasions. And there were a good few when Death and I stood eyeball to eyeball, when I knew I'd used up my odds, and in the next few moments I would be dead. I was always perfectly calm. There was no fighting, no raging to hang on. I was always perfectly at peace, and almost invariably I'd think to myself, so this is the way it is. What an uninspiring way to go in its way. It was a good feeling, because then I settle back and rock into whatever was going just as cool as ice. Men had been dying in battle for ages. What else was new? Live fast, die young, and have a good-look corpse, was how I and the rest of the raiders saw it, along with John Derrick, who said it first in the 1949 movie Knock on Any Door. The only thing to do was not worry about it at all, and have the best damn time you could while you were around. Of course, being a leader helped. You were always too busy bringing in air and artillery, moving your people and shepherding your herd to take time to focus in on yourself, on where you might be in a moment's time on the battlefield. You become very superstitious. You're always looking for something that's going to protect you from being killed. It might be a photo of the girl next door, it might be a rabbit's foot or a blanket. Yes, a security blanket which you huddled under, in the night. Phil Gilchrist's was a white T-shirt with a blue band around the collar. He never went into battle without it. My Chinese Wallam watch might have become a lucky charm for me if it hadn't been knocked off in the hospital after the 6th of February. But as it was, I didn't need it or any other, because I had an inside thing with God, and I prayed all the time. But early on I'd made a PCT with myself. It was never dear. God, please look after me. It was always, dear God, please look after my men, and make sure that no one gets killed. Suppose if I could have been objective about it, I would have realized that to lose men was just the breaks of the game. But I had built my little house of hope, and God dwell therein since I'd returned from the hospital after the 6th of February wound, which meant all of March. Until now, the 1st of November, we'd been in some really heavy combat taking stacks of weir, but among my men, we'd never taken any dead, the man, and I were tight. We've got a tough job for you. It will be the hardest one you're out here, had Colonel Sloan explained to me quietly. How many men have you got, and how soon will you be able to jump off? Colonel Sloan's tough job was a raider assault on Hill 400, what the infantry school would have called key terrain. It was a rocky, volcano-shaped hill that sat astride the left boundary of the Wolfhound Regiment, dominating the battlefield like a Spanish hilltop fortress. The enemy had occupied it for a long time. According to intelligence, there were no more than 50 Chinamen up there. But the enemy had burrowed deep into the hills, rocky slopes, and despite all tactics used or vast firepower employed, the Wolfhounds could not secure that piece of ground. We were assured it was not a kamikaze attack. Instead, Sloan said that it was critical and an operation perfectly tailored for our fleet-footed band of hill runners, though I might have mentioned that this perfectly tailored operation had only been designed for the raiders, after 2 or 3 different units of infantry had assaulted the hill, taking extreme casualties in the process. I accepted the mission without comment, but my gut started to churn. 400 was that Jake AEL feeling all over again, we jump off in 3 days on the morning of the first day. Key raider leaders and I conducted a visual reconnaissance of Hill 400 from Item Company's forward outpost position on Hill 275. The op was set on a grey knob a mile from the front, with our objective about 1/2 mile farther north along the ridge line. Damn said speed. This one won't be so goddamn tough. I wasn't sure I agreed for one thing. There were the ubiquitous mines and booby traps to be disarmed before we even got near. For another, our objective was a formidable piece of real estate with steep sides, and a rear anchored securely by the Chinese main battle positions on Hill 419 to the north. And the third thing was there was only one avenue of approach, it would be high. Did, right up the middle item. Company's grim-faced soldiers didn't help the foreboding feeling. They had a fugitive, hunted look about them. They all kept their heads down, moved fast, and didn't smile much. Everything about their hill reminded me of Uncle Roy's 1918 stories about Chateau Thiers and the Marne, the dugouts, the muddy slopes, the shell-ravaged trenches where brooding men just waited to be overcome by rolling yellow clouds of mustard gas, or to be ordered to hurl themselves into machine gun fire, tooling around in raiders. I had already shown me the sharp contrast between the lifestyles of the frontline troops and those located behind battalion forward bleak, endless trenches versus all the comforts under canvas of a stateside billet. The raiders were unusual as a rule. The army kept infantry have-nots far from the rear echelon haves, and though none of us felt guilty about the good life we led behind the lines, I often wondered what fighters like these guys up in Item thought when rotation came, and they saw all they'd been missing that night. Jimmy, Chris and he left Item's outpost for a closer look at the Chinese defensive positions on Hill 400. We'd been all around that fortress on previous operations, and never had been able to find a weak point. Now we were up there on it for almost 6 hours. Item Company guys who'd previously attacked the hill warned of accurate mortar fire and a damn tight defensive system. We disarmed a few mines, but nothing to get too excited about, found 3 outposts on the hill's southern nose, and behind that a trench bunker system, but that was all. We still couldn't find Hill 400's Achilles heel. We returned to our camp and worked out the plans on request. The artillery people had been punching the crap out of 400 with heavy 8 in delay stuff, since we'd gotten the warning order causing big sections of the enemy's breastworks to crumble in. But on the night itself there would be no artillery preparation or illumination. Our initial attack would be by stealth. We'd knock off the ops, move to our deployment position, and after forming a line of skirmishers, hit the trench works. Only when the shooting started would supporting fires be brought in to clobber the Chinese reverse slopes reinforcement routes and likely mortar and artillery positions. Sloan approved the plan. He also told me he'd have a regimental forward aid station set up behind Item's outpost. A comforting thought, but one that did little to assuage my concern about the opera, then reminding me that I was long overdue to go home. He added, "I don't want any heroics up there, Dave. No heroics, I thought, right? Like telling Johnny Reb not to click his heels together when Dixie was played, besides just going up that hill was worth a double blue max for all of us. We briefed the troops. Every man knew exactly where he was to go and what he was to do when he got there. I guess Chris and I were snapping out orders and carrying on like real badass regulars in the hospital 1,000 years later. Sprinkler told me that's how the guys had known we were in it deep. So while Fort made satchel charges and Skagen played fireman with his said portable flamethrower, the rest of the raiders rehearsed the operation and readied their gear. The boys looked good. I was pleased we moved up behind Item under the cover of darkness the night before the raid. I didn't want to tip our hand, but I wanted my guys on the hill in the morning so they could get a good look at 400 during daylight, then be rested and set to go at first dark. They had their look and then spread out among items, reverse slope bunkers, caught some shutty. A number of the guys wrote letters, some in earnest, some in justice, the latter group wrinkling them up and rubbing them in the dirt, so that if they got zapped, whoever was on the receiving end would know that life in the trenches was tough, and war was hell. After a last look at foreboding 400, I sacked out for the rest of the day. Unlike Jake Abel, I slept like a bear. The sun dropped out of the sky like an incoming round. Suddenly it was pitch black, the perfect night to attack no moon, and a thick blanket of fog that settled over the battlefield. Jimmy moved first. His scout section was through the wire and gone without a sound. Jack Speed's squad was next, followed by me and Don and ER with his radio. Next were Bill Smith's and Tex Garvin's people. All was going just like rehearsals for once. Everyone seemed to have gotten the word. No one fired at us from Item. No flares were sent up to make us sitting ducks in no man's land. The inevitable first hitch occurred, just as I'd cleared Item's wire word was passed up that a raider in Smith's squad was refusing to go a step farther. I had nearly halt the infiltrating column, and I went back to find this guy hunkered down in the patrol path like a mule. Until now he'd been a good man. He had at least a dozen raids under his belt, but now he wouldn't budge. He said he'd had it. He couldn't go on. I told him that his timing was off. He should have turned in his quit slip before we left home, and that his ass was going up that hill sobbing. He told me to get screwed, hit him on both sides of his face with my pistol, and said that there wasn't a raider out there who wanted to go, but they'd all made the commitment when they'd gone through the wire the boy wouldn't be moved. I pulled my trench knife out of my boot and laid it against his throat. Did just as soon cut your throat as mess with you. I said you either go on this raid or die. If kill you, I'll report that you bought the farm in a big burst of glory. Make up your mind after a few seconds. Between muffled sobs he said he'd go. The crews of the 3 enemy ops must have forgotten the old soldier's creed, stay alert and stay alive. The open, they were virtually harmless firecrackers we'd learned to dance around, and more or less ignore. The problem on Hill 400, though, was that the defenders weren't just throwing potato mashers, they were also hurling frags. We hadn't counted on that, and the sky was black with them. Many rolled down the hill and exploded out of range behind us, proving one of Captain Michael's pet theories over in George. It was actually safer up front doing the fighting than hiding behind where you became a sitting duck for grenades and incoming. But many found a raider target. Smith's guys had a hard time. They took a number of casualties and couldn't gain an inch of ground until Speed's fighters thundered forward in a wild attack. These men overwhelmed one of the unexpected positions, and now Speed's complete force was in there, mopping up the price filtered back to me. We'd taken 3 dead and more than 20 wounded. It's just a nightmare. The words bubbled up in my brain almost to a man. The wounded raiders refused to leave the hill. Doc Brakeman was performing miracles in his ever-growing field hospital in a shell hole behind the trench below us. The kids determinedly returned to the fighting the minute they got patched up. Some, like Jimmy, who'd already gotten shot in the arse in the arm, didn't even bother with the patching. Everyone knew we were a lean outfit, and that every gun counted. It was that family bonding again. No one was going to let his brothers down, especially in a fight like this. Even at the cost of his life, I called for Chris and Fort to bring up their people. We needed everybody online. Damn, a lot of rear security if you're losing the fight. A strong rear won't do you any good. We were running low on ammo and grenades, so we took all we could from enemy dead. I told the leaders to let me know when they were rearmed, reorganized, and set to go. We had to banzai the crap out of the hilltop in a hurry. It was the only way we'd take it, and if we didn't jump off soon, we'd be nickel and dimed to death by what seemed like ever-increasing scores of frags bouncing down from above. Green tracers from a machine gun raked our position. It was set up in a rocky outcrop near the top of Thel Hill, firing right down Speed's throat. No way could he get his people through that. The way it stood now, they couldn't even return fire, The gun had to go. Brave raiders. Smith and Salazar on the left took on the deadly challenge. There was little cover and no concealed approaches to the gun, just a fold in the ground in the centre of Smith's front, which the machine gun could not depress low enough to cover raider weapons laid down good covering fire as the two volunteers crawled up the hill. I like these men, especially Smith, an Alabamian who I initially hadn't been sure was raider material because he'd gotten his stripes, the National Guard weekend warrior way. The funny thing was that Smith didn't think he deserved those stripes either. He was embarrassed about them, and always seemed to go out ton of his way to prove himself, even when it was no longer necessary. Maybe it still riled him a bit when we called him NG due to his National Guard origins. Still, by now, he did. It was just a loving nickname for a brave and trusted comrade in arms. Now under our fire, he and Salazar snake through the dead space toward the gun. About 20 yards from their objective, Salazar blasted with his weapon, and Smith rushed forward screaming as he unleashed two large Chinese anti-tank grenades. Both hit home, exploding on impact. The machine gun and crew were blown to a million pieces. The two raiders turned and started back toward us. Then I jumped up on the outcrop and fired a long, long burst. Both men fell, their momentum sending them tumbling into our position. Smith died in my arms. I cried as I held him. It's just a nightmare, I thought, and then I swore we'd take that goddamn hill speeder jumped off as soon as the machine gun blew. Garvin, picking up the reins from Smith, attacked on the left item. Company put a mortar fire all over the top of the hill. We came up right under its speeds. People hit the top like a bulldozer, closely, followed by Garvin's squad, the die-hard. Chinese were making a determined last stand as raiders fanned out savage close-in fighting and hand-to-hand combat, with a bloody order of the day shift, the mortar fire to the back of the hill. I yelled to Neri grenade. Shouted Raider Mendoza, who was kneeling about 3 feet away from me. We went for cover. Mendoza and NER hit the ground. I spun but tripped and rolled down the slope. I stopped rolling about the same time as the grenade, the same place as the grenade. It was under me when it exploded. The blast propelled me into the air like a rocket. Moments later, a 160 pounds rag doll fell to the ground with a heavy thud. I could not get any air. I was choking and gasping. Horrible sucking sounds were coming out of my chest fire. I thought my chest and left side were on fire. I groaned and tried to breathe. I figured my lungs had burst. Then I stopped moaning. It took too much energy. Hackworth's done for. The words floated down the old man's dead. No speed. No, I'm not dead. I moaned again louder, but Jack was gone. Screw you, Jack, speed. I'm not dead, and I ain't gonna die. Not on this goddamn hill. I dragged myself to my feet and headed for the dock. He checked me out and got me breathing while I sent word to Chris to take command and get a prisoner. My left arm was broken and hanging from my shoulder by ripped flesh and torn muscle. Scores of shrapnel wounds covered my burned chest. But I would live, and for the second time a submachine gun had saved my life, a submachine gun and good trust training. When I'd rolled down that hill, I'd tucked my Thompson into my gut, as I'd been trained, and rolled with it under me. The weapon not, I had taken the full impact of the explosion. Johnny Watkins drifted in a grenade, had blown the crap out of him. He said things were heating up, that Chris had been hit in the leg, and Speed had assumed command. I could hear the increased fire above, and after a shot of morphine in a little brakeman bedside manner, he wrapped my arm in a heavy Carlisle bandage and made a sling out of an empty M1 bandolier. I headed back to the fight. It was almost dawn. The Chinese had been counter-attacking since I'd been hit. Only now was the assault beginning to falter. Raiders, all wounded, had been pushed back. They lay near the crest of the hill and cut the enemy down as they came over the top. I picked up a little M2 carbine. It was nothing like my Thompson now, a black and twisted mess, but I could fire it like a pistol with my one good hand, and I joined in the fray. It was getting light enough to see now. To my right lay Chief Denny and XEAC Trooper Hearn. Both had been hit, Denny in both arms, and Hearn down from a head wound. Hearn couldn't see, and Denny couldn't shoot. So the Oklahoma Cowboy and the Arizona Indian Brave had formed a posy of one. Denny gave directions while Hearn fired the weapon, red man, white man, kill him. Yell, "Hello, man," Teeks. Garvin was over to the left, both legs badly blasted by shot he couldn't move, but he put down effective fire as calmly and deliberately as if he were at the KD range at Camp Pendleton, striking for a USMC expert's badge. Neera crawled over to me with a message from Colonel Sloan, "Put Crispino in command and get yourself down to item." "You never got that message, NER," I snapped, but Hack, he was serious. Shut off the radio. All colonels are serious, but there was nothing Sloan or anyone could have done for us right now. We needed to know what the hell was happening. It seemed as if we'd already wiped out the whole Chinese army, and the bastards were still coming. I asked NER if the guys had gotten a prisoner yet. He replied in the negative and slipped into the cordite dawn, while I backed off from the top of the hill to take a moment to examine the situation. All but a handful of raiders had been hit most twice, and more than 25 wounded, and at last count 5 dead, including the boy who tried to quit at the LD, had he known something I hadn't. Most of our leaders were down speed, had taken a shot in the belly, and was shooting with one hand holding his guts in with the other. We were totally dependent on captured weapons. Our ammo supply was gone. We'd reached a Fisher-cut bait situation.